Okay, there we go. So we will be in person on Tuesday. Okay, I get to see all of your faces, put names to faces, which will be great. I'm excited to see you guys in person. As long as nothing changes over the weekend, which I don't think it's going to, we're going to be in person. Okay, so no more meeting on Zoom or any of that. Please remember that you do have to upload your vaccination card, proof of vaccine through your student center. So hopefully you guys have done that. But if you haven't, it's pretty easy. You just go into your student center and there's like a tab for COVID vaccination. I don't know what it actually says, but it's basically like proof of vaccination. Okay. You do have to have your proof of booster by February 28th if you're eligible for that. Okay. So what that means is if it's been 6 months since your second dose, you're eligible for the booster. If you recently got your second dose, you're not eligible for the booster yet. So you wouldn't have to provide proof of that until it's been 6 months, right? Now, I am not entirely sure how they are enforcing this. I know that last semester when going on campus, there were checkpoints and they would ask and they would check your app and things like that. But I'm not sure how they're doing it this semester. So just play it safe, make sure it's done. Please don't forget, upload it. It's very easy to do. You can take a picture of the card on your phone and upload it to your student center. As far as those, I have a question about medically exempt. Yeah, as far as I know, testing is what you have to do. I know that the president sent an email recently, and there's a lot of information on that. So do read through that and see if, what information is there. I haven't had a chance to read his entire email. So, but I do know that he gave a lot of information on what you have to do and all the requirements we have. I know they're constantly changing, and it's hard to keep on top of all this stuff. So that's why I'm trying to remember to remind you guys too, so that, next week doesn't come and you don't know what's going on. Okay. And then my other reminder is that masks will be non-negotiable in the classroom. Okay. I'm not going to argue with people. I'm not going to debate about it. You will wear a mask if you want to come into my classroom. And that'll be that. Okay. All right. Any questions? Oh, and then one other thing. So I did post, there's going to be a online event with the Student Association of Applied Behavior Analysis. So they're the ABA student group on campus. If any of you are interested in getting involved with that or what they do, they put on a lot of really great events through the semesters. They have guest speakers and social events, and they do like a job fair, which is really cool every semester. So if you guys are interested in that, I've posted the flyer and the Zoom link on Canvas. So you can find that on the course Canvas page. And I think they have someone from the association that's going to actually come to our class in person and talk to you guys about it as well. So I just wanted to let you know that that's up. Any other questions? Oh, which Scantron do you need for your exams? Yeah. It's the long, skinny green one. I need to figure out the number. I haven't been on campus yet. They have them in our office, and then I can let you know exactly what the number is. But it's the white and green. It's like white and green, and it's long and skinny. That's the one. So I'll try to have a sample one in class on Tuesday so I can hold it up and show it to you guys so you know exactly what you need. Yeah, you'll know it when you see it, because there's like big blue ones that are like the size of a page. It's not that one. There's like tiny little short ones, like little quiz ones. It's not that one. It's like I guess maybe it's like the length of a page, right? It's about 8 inches long, but it's skinny. Okay, and it's white and green. Yeah, full page length, but half width. Yes, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Okay, all right. Any other, let's go over the quiz real quick. Okay. All right. Okay. This individual was first to describe the conditioned reflex. Anyone want to tell me who that was? Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov, right? Thorndike was law of effects. John Watson was the founder of behaviorism, and B.F. Skinner we have not gotten to yet. Ivan Pavlov. Behavior is defined by what people
do and say.
Do and say, yep. It's not what they believe and feel, right? It's not what they don't do. We talked about that, right? That kind of like double negative, the dead man's test, right? It's what they say and do, or do and say. Charlie drinks too many, that's the key words right there, too many cups of coffee each day. This behavior would be considered a behavioral what?
Excess.
Excess, very good. If we said Charlie does not drink enough water each day, what would that be?
A deficit.
A deficit, very good, right? So when the behavior is happening too much and we want to make it go down, it's an excess. When a behavior is not happening enough and we want it to increase, it's a deficit. Very good. The amount of force involved in the behavior.
Intensity.
Intensity, very good. That's how forceful a behavior is. Can anyone tell me what latency is? That's a tricky one.
Is that the one where it's oh gosh, I just had it. It's like when the event happens to the start of the behavior.
Correct. So it's that time from the event to the start of the behavior, right? Very good. How about frequency? Can anyone tell me what frequency is?
It's how many times it occurs.
Yes, very good. The number of times the behavior occurs. How about duration?
How long
the behavior lasts?
Yep. Good job, you guys. How long the behavior lasts. Very good. Okay. If we say Charlie is frustrated, what is this?
Label.
A label, right? It actually doesn't tell us anything about Charlie's behavior. We have no idea what he's doing or why we know he's frustrated or how we know that, right? It's just a label. It's too general of a description. We need a specific description of his behavior. Can anyone give me a specific description of Charlie's frustrated behavior? What might he be doing?
Charlie was throwing crayons all over the floor and looking distraught. Would that be, or no?
That's still a label. So get more specific.
With throwing
crayons, that was perfect.
Okay.
Throwing crayons on the floor. Okay. Perfect. Stomping his feet. Right. Does anyone else want to give an example? Oh, come on, you guys were so tough.
Screaming.
Yes, screaming. Good, right? So specific behaviors. Frustrated is just a label. It's an overarching term that can cover a lot of things, right? So whenever you have something like that, typically emotions are labels, right? Angry, sad, frustrated, nervous, scared. Those are all labels, right? You need to get down to the specific nitty-gritty behaviors. Okay. Any questions about those? So hopefully if you got them incorrect, just take notes on that. You can see the correct answers on Canvas, so you can go back and, or actually, no, I think the quiz closes. But if you have any questions about those, you can reach out, let me know, ask questions, and I can go over. Oh, good. You guys were saying things in the chat. Yeah, hitting the wall, slamming the door, stomping, throwing items. Good. All of those are specific behaviors of frustration. Right? Very good. Okie doke. Where did we leave off? We left off with the little Albert experiment, I believe. Oh, sorry. Did we go over behavioral dimensions? I thought we did we not? Yeah, latency, duration. Yeah, latency, duration, frequency. I'm pretty sure we went over that in like our very first lecture probably, which is posted on Canvas. So if you need it or need a refresher, it is posted on Canvas, okay? All right. All right. So I think this is where we left off. We talked about how John Watson conditioned little Albert, right, to show fear of a rat, and then generalized that fear to a number of other white furry objects, right? So like a rabbit, a fur coat, and the scary Santa Claus mask, which I think someone in the last class said I would be scared of that too. I second that. It was a little creepy. If you've ever seen the video, I think if I haven't posted the video on your Canvas page, I will. Because they show like the mask and it is very freaky looking. But the other things, right? The white rabbit, the furry coat, those are pretty not scary objects. And yet the child still emitted a fear response to those objects, right? After he was conditioned to show fear in the presence of a rat. So, okay. All right, B.F. Skinner. So he is the one who expanded on the field of behaviorism from John Watson's original, theory about behaviorism and behavior modification. Okay, so he was the first one who also distinguished between respondent and operant conditioning, or operant learning, respondent operant learning. Okay. Respondent conditioning or respondent learning looks at innate behaviors, right? Things that you're born with. So think of Pavlov's dogs, right? No one had to teach the dogs how to salivate in the presence of food, right? That's respondent. And when they paired a bell with it, the dog eventually learned to salivate in the presence of the bell alone. Right, we did talk about this, right? Just want to make sure. Let me look. Yes, right. So in the presence of the bell alone, dog learns to salivate, right? That's classical or respondent conditioning, okay? Because the salivation is a behavior that we don't have to teach the dogs how to do, but they do learn to salivate in the presence of the bell alone rather than just the food. So Skinner kind of went, okay, that type of learning, right, where there's a behavior that's involved that we didn't have to teach the organism to do. We didn't have to teach the dog how to salivate. That experiment is very different from this other experiment, which was done with cats and puzzle boxes, Thorndike, right? Skinner looked at this experiment and went, this is different. This is different from what we did with the dogs, okay? The reason being, this is a behavior the cat had to learn how to do. Cats aren't born knowing how to pull a lever string down to open a trap door, right? So this type of learning, Skinner looked at this and said, this is different from the type of learning that the dogs went through with the bell and the food. These are different things. Okay, so he's the one that really distinguished between respondent learning, which is what was involved with Pavlov's dogs, versus operant learning, which is what is involved with Thorndike's cats. Okay. He wrote, a number of books and published research. He did a ton of basic work with pigeons. That's what he's most known for, and rats as well. And his work is really the foundation of behavior analysis that we have today. Okay. He's also the one who said, we don't only have to look at overt observable behaviors, we can account for covert behaviors as well. So things like thinking, dreaming, right? And things like that. So his most well-known behavior or book is known as Verbal Behavior, where he explains all of these things. Because basically a fellow psychologist at the time basically challenged Skinner and said, from a behaviorist perspective, you can't explain all of the things that we can explain with psychology. And Skinner kind of went, well, I think I can. And he spent many years dissecting language and our behavior from a behavior analysis perspective. Okay. So he's really the one that brought us where we are today in the field. Here's one of his experiments with the rats. He conducted numerous studies, like I said, looking at basic behavioral principles. Here he's looking at just rate of responding and series of rapid responses and things like that. He used what is called a cumulative recorder. So the pen would kind of go like, it would jump every time the rat made a response, and it would record. You can kind of see it on the bottom right-hand corner of that picture, but that is recording on paper, and it would print out this really long thing, and it would have all the data on it. Okay. At Sac State, we actually have a rat lab. It's pretty amazing. Dr. Kyle Miguel is the one who teaches those courses. I've taught them before as well when he was on sabbatical. I've taken the courses, I've taken the grad classes on it. It's Psych 181. So if you end up loving this class, I always tell students, try to get into 181. It's an amazing class because you actually get to see all of the stuff we talk about, right? How we predict behavior, how we control behavior, how we manipulate behavior, manipulate the environment to produce behavior. You actually get to do that with a rat, right? You actually get to see all of these things play out in a real world situation where you teach a rat how to do certain things and measure their behavior and things like that. So it's really, really cool. If you have the opportunity, or if you're all interested in doing something like that, I highly recommend that you take Psych 181. It's only offered in the fall. So you kind of have to plan around it, but there are very few live animal labs left at the undergrad level. I actually think, I know we're one of them. I know Stanislaus has a pigeon lab, but for undergrad, at the undergrad level, that's kind of it. There are a few other behavior analysis animal labs in like master's programs or PhD programs, but not very many at the undergrad level. So, if you're at all interested, definitely take advantage of that opportunity because most people just don't have access to that like you guys do. Okay, this is just a kind of a historical like timeline. This is not something I'm gonna put on your exam. It's more just to let you guys know kind of like the order of events. So Thorndike was kind of the first one to come along with law of effect. He was actually looking at animal intelligence. Watson and Pavlov kind of happened around the same time. So Watson came on the scene as far as establishing what behaviorism is before Pavlov. But Watson didn't conduct his little Albert experiment until after he saw the experiments coming out of Pavlov's lab. Skinner came on the scene in the 30s and 40s. He starts publishing Behavior of Organisms, Science and Human Behavior, Verbal Behavior. He's the one that laid the groundwork for the field we have today. In 58, JAB, which is the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior, that was the very first behavior analysis journal that was published. Okay, so up until that point, up until 58, any work that was being done by behavior analysts had to be submitted to the psychology journals at the time. And most of their work was turned away because they, like I said, were largely going against the grain of psychology. Okay, they were separating themselves from psychology at the time, and their work was kind of frowned upon. Okay, so a lot of their work got turned away. And so in 58, they established the first journal of behavior analysis. That was a pretty big moment. Behavior Research and Therapy was another journal that came after that. JABA was another big one. And Beowulf and Risley in 68, they published the article of behavior mechanisms and kind of basically outlined what behavior analysis is and how we use it and why we use it. Okay. And then various journals opened up throughout the years. Certification in behavior analysis happened in the early 2000s. So as you can see, like we're pretty young science, it kind of started in like 1911. So we just barely have passed our 100-year mark. We're a pretty young science. Things are still constantly changing as the field grows. We're still making lots of new discoveries and things like that. So ABA is relatively young when we look at the age of the science itself. There are lots of different areas of applications that can be used. Again, I'm not going to, include a lot of this on your exam, but I just want you to be aware, because I think that people think of ABA and they think, they just automatically, they automatically think working with kids with autism, right? Like if you're going to be an ABA, that's where you're going to work. Yes, a lot of people do that. What I would say is the largest area. But that is not the only thing you can do. Okay? Any individuals with any kind of developmental disability or mental illness are people that we can work with. I work with adults, for example, which is very different from working with children. The relationship you have, the different parameters that you can use treatments within are very different. Let's see, special education and education. So there's lots of behavior analysts in schools, school districts, public schools, pay for these services. This is something that is provided to kids for free if they're in the public school system. So they do have to employ behavior analysts and make sure that those things are available to them. Business and industry services. So we'll touch on that a little bit throughout the semester, but OBM is what it's called, organizational behavior management. I did this the entire time I was in grad school. This is where you actually work with a company. So you're not assessing individualistic behaviors, but you're looking at employee behavior overall, and you're helping companies, increase like productivity, or maybe if they're having like injuries or mistakes that are being made on the job, you would help them assess why that is happening and how can we change it, and things like that. So you can actually work with a company, an organization, rather than individual people, right? Which is a really cool area. There's lots of behavior analysts in sports and like health related behaviors. Gerontology is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. So, helping people rehab in terms of their movement and speech and different behaviors that they have learned, and have to relearn after they've had like a stroke or something like that, or a head injury, and things like that. They're even starting to do a lot of research and treatment with individuals who have dementia and Alzheimer's, right? So helping them with certain behaviors there. So there's lots of areas that you can go into. You are not only restricted to working with kids with autism. So I just want to make sure that you guys kind of are aware of that. There is a certification for ABA. So you do have to go through a program, a master's program, and then you can sit for your BCBA and get certified. So there is a certification that goes along with this practice. Okay, let me pull up our next. We're going to move into, so we're going to switch gears. We were kind of talking about all the historical stuff, the history of ABA. So now we're going to start to get into what we actually do with it. And here, let's see. Does ABA play a role in addiction recovery? Yes. So there are people who work in that area of the field with ABA. Contingency management is usually what they use. So things like, when you have programs, for example, who employ people who have used drugs in the past, right? And they get a certain amount of pay if they test negative, right? So those programs will often pay the individuals more. Like there's the opportunity to make more money if their drug tests come back negative versus if they come back positive, they get paid like a certain amount, right? And that is all put in place by behaviorists. Another example I can give you. So, when you sit down to drive your car, if you don't buckle your seatbelt, that really annoying ding, right? That ding, 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 ding to remind you to put your seatbelt on. That was actually established by someone who was a behaviorist, who worked for a car company. When they were years ago, when they were trying to figure out how to get people to wear their seatbelts, right? Because when that first, you guys are definitely all too young for this, but seatbelts used to kind of be like a negotiable thing, right? Especially in like the, early 1900s and 1950s into the 1960s even. I remember my mom talking about being a kid and just like hopping in the car and like no seatbelt, or like her younger brothers and sisters being brought home from the hospital in a little basket on the floor of the car, right? Seatbelts and car seats, those weren't a thing. So when that new law was passed about having to wear seatbelts, people just didn't wear them. They just didn't, because they hadn't for so long. So car companies were working, with their safety experts, like, how do we get people to wear a seatbelt? Well, there was a behaviorist on staff who was like, well, we can put this annoying bell in there that will remind people constantly, you have to put your seatbelt on. So those are like all different things that you can do in the field of behavior analysis. It's, actually pretty cool. A lot of tech apps now, especially the dating apps, you guys. So like, I'm old, I'll admit it. I haven't been on the dating scene for a really long time, but I know about Tinder and I think Hinge, and any other like online one. Like I think one's called like Plenty of Fish, or I don't know the names of all of them, but they all have behaviorists on staff. They all have a department that is filled with behavior analysts and psychologists, because they're assessing people's behavior and matching them, right? And they're the ones behind the scenes, like doing all of the assessment as to how you match people. And how you look at like their likes and their dislikes and their personality and all these things. Like, how is it that certain people come across your screen or across your choices? This is how they do it. They have a department of behaviorists who are looking at this, and telling them how to program the app. So again, like, that's a whole industry that you can go into, that has nothing to do with individuals with disabilities, right? Like, it's a dating app. And lots of the tech industry now is doing that. They're employing, even like Google and Facebook, they have a whole department of behavior psychologists that are just employed to make sure that their employees are happy. Like, what do we have to do as a company to make sure our employees are productive and happy in their jobs, right? So they have a whole department that does that you could get into. So there's so many areas. Don't think that this is just limited to one thing. Okay. All right, switching gears, we're going to go into chapter 2, which is observing and recording behavior. Yeah, criminal profiling, they do definitely use behaviorists on that. And people have gone into, so they've like done like a double major type thing in ABA and then also in criminal justice, but that's definitely another area that you can go into. All right. So one main aspect of behavior analysts, or a fundamental aspect that we have, is measuring the targeted behavior, or the behavior we want to change. So remember, I talked about last class, the behavior that we're looking at, right? The behavior that we're observing, the specific behavior we're observing and taking data on, is the target behavior, okay? And we measure this behavior at various points in time. We do it before we implement any kind of treatment. We, of course, take data during treatment, and then we also do this after treatment. Okay, so all of this measurement together, all of these measures that we're taking of that targeted behavior, is called a behavioral assessment. Okay, it's measuring the targeted behavior for change. Okay. So why is this important when we're implementing a behavior change protocol or a treatment of some kind? Why are this constant collection of data? Why is this so important? So first, we take data on the problem or on the behavior before it even happens, before treatment happens, because we need to decide if there's even a problem that exists. So you do run into this sometimes. Usually in the classroom, I would say most of this time this happens with teacher, and in classrooms, sometimes it can happen with a parent as well, where they'll report a behavior as being problematic, right? And when we say problematic, what we mean by that is it in some way interferes with that individual's functioning of their life, right? So either they cannot function in the classroom, like they cannot get their work done, or they're causing others to not get their work done. Or if it's happening at home, they're not able to do certain things to get through the day, right? So if there's truly a behavior that is problematic, it will in some way affect their daily functioning, okay? So we want to take data on it, because sometimes, even though a teacher or a parent or a caregiver will report that the behavior is a problem, maybe it's just a problem for them. It could be that the behavior they're engaging in is kind of just annoying, right? We do see that quite often, and we're like, okay, well, we took data on it, and yes, it does happen, but it doesn't prevent the child from doing anything they want to do, right? So for example, let's say you do have a child who flaps their hands. Now, a child with autism who flaps their hands for visual stimulation. Now, you do have some individuals who constantly flap their hands nonstop, and they can't, like, they don't do anything else, right? They can't communicate with others. They can't answer questions. They can't, work on a project. They can't, like, this is interfering with all of their other learning and experience in their environment because they're doing this so much. So, okay, we would take data on that. We would see that it is happening like 95% of the day. This is a significant problem. We're going to address it. But some kids just do it sometimes, right? Maybe a kid is sitting in class and he's quiet and sitting and working on his math sheet, but he's waving his hand over here on the side. Okay, well, maybe the teacher thinks it's annoying, but the kid is getting his work done. He's not making loud noises and preventing anyone else from getting their work done. It's not influencing his performance, which means that he's doing his work and he's doing well on the work. So we would kind of look at that and go, well, it's not really a problem, right? It's not really a problem. So that's why we take data before we do any kind of treatment. We need to see if there really even is a problem that we need to address, because sometimes there isn't. The second purpose of the behavioral assessment is to decide on the best treatment plan possible. Okay. So when we take data before treatment, it gives us a lot of information about that behavior. It tells us when it happens. Okay. It tells us how often, the frequency of the behavior, how often it happens, maybe how long. If we take duration data, we can figure out how long the behavior is happening. Maybe it only happens in one environment. Maybe it only happens in the presence of certain people and not in the presence of others. So that kind of pre-data, that baseline data is what we call it, gives us a lot of information to help us decide on what the best treatment plan is going to be. Okay. The third purpose of the behavioral assessment is to measure our treatment effects. So this is why we take data during treatment, right? If we don't take data during it, we can't see if it's actually working or not. Okay, so we want to see, once we've implemented the plan, okay, once we've implemented treatment, we should see movement in the correct direction. If it's a behavior we're trying to increase, we should see that behavior go up. If it's a behavior we're trying to decrease, right, we should see it go down. And you should see that change in a relatively short amount of time. Okay, it doesn't happen overnight. I'm not saying it happens overnight, but you should see a change, within a week or so, week or two. And we constantly are taking data through that time, because if the behavior doesn't change at all, we want to switch up our treatment plan as soon as possible, right? We don't want to leave an individual with a plan that's not working for them. So we do have to change it if necessary. So that's why we're constantly taking data during treatment as well. And then finally, the fourth reason we take all of these treatments, all of this measurement of the behavior and of the data, is as a treatment component in and of itself. So we're looking at reactivity. Okay, so this is where your behavior changes because you're being observed, right? So I kind of talked about that in our last lecture. I think I talked about the rapid eating study that I worked on, and how people would slow their eating down, right, if they knew someone was watching them. So that's reactivity. So we can also see how behavior changes when an individual is being watched. So we can actually look at reactivity and measure it, right? Versus when they don't know that they're being observed. Okay. There are two types of behavioral assessments that we can do. So the first is what we call an indirect assessment. These involve things like interviews, questionnaires, rating scales, and we often are talking to the parents, the caregivers, the teachers, anyone who can inform us what the individual's behavior looks like, okay? So when we say indirect, we mean that we're not directly observing the person's behavior. We're more asking questions about it, okay? Now, we go in and we do this typically when we're doing intake on a client, right? So the first thing we do is we go in and do an indirect assessment. I do this with all of my clients, and because they're adults, they are able to determine what their goals should be and what treatments they want to use and work on. And so they're always involved in this part of the assessment too. So I interview them as well. So we'll gather different information on form or topography of the behavior. So that's what the behavior looks like, okay? I'll ask questions about where it happens, when it happens, who's present when it happens. We'll take what is called ABC data, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but basically we record antecedents and consequences. We record what happens right before the behavior occurs, and we look at what happens right after. And this is just me asking them, like, when you engage in this behavior, or when so-and-so engages in this behavior, what happens right before? Okay. We also ask about any past treatments that they've been exposed to, if they worked for them or didn't, and why. And then we also collect all of the general information we can. I ask about their daily routine. I ask what time they wake up, what time they eat breakfast, what time do they brush their teeth. I ask about all the different things they do throughout the day. What time do they go to bed? Do they sleep through the night? And so on and so forth. So we get all of that general information in these assessments as well. The advantages of these assessments, they're relatively easy. They don't take a lot of time. I mean, typically I'm with a client for about an hour, and I can get all of this information from them. And they're pretty easy, right? You're just sitting down with them and talking about it. I can even do that over Zoom if I have to, right? So if someone gets sick, or if when we were, in lockdown, and we couldn't go see clients in person, I could still do indirect assessments online, which was great. And so those are big advantages of that. But there are some disadvantages to the indirect assessment. You do have to rely on the informants, whoever that is, whether it's the individual themselves or the caretaker or the teacher. You're relying on their memory of the event, okay? Which, as we're going to talk about throughout the semester, people's memories are not always 100% accurate. And in most cases, they're not very accurate at all. They may have some bias that they're inserting in their opinion or how they viewed the situation, but it might not be a truly objective account of what happened, okay? Which then would lead to an incorrect hypothesis on our part of why the behavior is occurring, okay? So that is a disadvantage of the indirect assessment. We typically never stop there, okay? That's just the first step. So usually we take care of those disadvantages because we go in and do other things, which I'll talk about in a minute. But those, if you were to only do an indirect assessment, those are kind of the drawbacks of it. So yeah, they're really useful as a first step to kind of get an idea. And that's how I use it. I'm like, okay, well, I'm pretty sure that this is why the behavior is happening based on everything you've told me. But it's usually not enough information to just go, okay, I have all the information I need. We're going to start treatment. So we usually don't make that jump quite yet. It's just a starting point. So the second type of behavioral assessment, so this is kind of the next step, is direct assessment. Okay, so this is where you directly observe the target behavior. You observe it and you take data on it. You record it. Okay, so now you're actually seeing the target behavior for yourself rather than relying on the informant's account of the behavior. So we start with the indirect assessment, but then we want to view it ourselves. We want to see the behavior ourselves. This isn't always possible. With kids, you can get around this pretty easily just by being with them a lot, but adults are a little different. So I work with adults. And I do have some clients that I work with who engage in some pretty serious problem behavior. They engage in things like aggression, yelling, temper tantrum behaviors as I define those, and so on and so forth. And they won't do it in front of me. Okay, they just won't. They know who I am and they know why I'm there. And they won't misbehave in front of me. They just don't do it. And I try, I do all of the things that I know is going to kind of agitate them and get them going. So for example, if we have an individual who always throws things at their family home provider when they're asked to do a chore, I come into the home. I don't tell them I'm coming. I tell the family home provider, but I don't tell my client I'm coming. I come straight into the home and I ask them to do a bunch of things. And what do? They do all the things for me which is good. They're really happy to see me. I enjoy seeing them. So that's good. I'm clearly paired as a positive stimulus, but I can't observe their behavior. So you have to get kind of creative. I'll have someone record it for me if they can, or call me when it's happening so I can see it and hear it. So you do have to get a little creative when you cannot observe a behavior yourself, because that does happen sometimes. But ideally, we would directly observe the behavior. Okay. So
Professor,
yes,
sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
So sorry. I had a really quick question about indirect assessment before we move too far on.
Yes.
Is the indirect assessment just for like caregivers and parents, or do you ever like give an assessment to the person who's actually doing the behaviors?
Yeah. So again, it depends on how well they can communicate, how old they are, right? When you're working in like early intervention situations, sometimes you're working with a kid who's not even 2, who can't talk. So you do rely on parents and caregivers. But like with older kids, or a kid who can communicate with you just fine when you're asking these questions, you would definitely want to involve them. When I work with adults, my clients are always involved. Okay. I don't ever do an indirect assessment without them present. So I certainly interview everyone in the home, their family home provider, their caretaker, but I always have the client present as well. It's just a little bit more tricky with kids, right? Depending on the age, you couldn't ask them all of these questions. They don't know. Like you ask them what time do you go to bed, and they're looking like, I don't know, whenever mom says I go to bed, right? Or same thing in the classroom. Like they might not know what their schedule is and what they're doing. You're having to ask the teacher that. But whenever you can involve them, you should.
Okay.
Yeah, they should be involved if they can be. Okay. So a couple advantages of the direct assessment, of course, is that it's more objective than indirect methods, right? It's objective in the sense that you're actually seeing it, okay? It's not someone else's opinion. It's not based on someone else's memory or the parts that they can or cannot remember. You're actually seeing the behavior yourself and recording it, okay? So it's much more objective and more accurate, right? You're seeing it in the moment, rather than depending on an account of it later. So it's a huge advantage, right? There are still a couple disadvantages to it, even though ideally this is always what you want to do. It is time consuming. Sometimes I have to go to my clients' houses several times before I can observe a behavior. I have to schedule around things. So if I'm working on a client, for example, on their showering practices, I have to go when they take their shower. So if they take their shower at 8:30 in the morning, I better be there at like 8:15 before they get out of bed, right? And that can be time consuming. And then I have to stay there for the entire time, so I can see like how long they're in the shower and things like that. It requires trained observers, right? So I couldn't just call up my family home provider and say, hey, can you watch so-and-so? Or can you time them? Like, I'm looking at a bunch of different things for a behavior. I can't just call someone up who's not trained on how to do that and just have them do that. So it does require that I do that. From my point of view, that's not that bad. I schedule myself and all of those things, but think of it like from an organizational view, for example, they pay me a lot more than they would pay, just a normal clinician, right? So it's time consuming, it costs more, but it is necessary. Like I said, there are instances where you may not be able to observe the behavior, but whenever possible, you must. That gives you the best picture of what is going on with the behavior, and your treatment plan will be more accurate and will work better if you do this, if you do a direct observation. Okay, so we're going to talk about the necessary steps for developing a plan to record behavior. Okay, so we'll unpack each of these in a moment. First, I'm just going to very quickly go over the list, and then I'll go into detail. So the first thing we're going to do is define the target behavior, so we know exactly what we're observing. Then we're going to determine how we're going to record this. Okay, who's going to record it, where they're going to record it, when, how, the materials they need, and so on and so forth. Choosing the recording method, so what we're recording. So this will be like dimension of the behavior, right? Latency, duration, intensity, and so forth. Choose a recording instrument. That's how we're going to record something. What do we need for that? Okay. We must consider reactivity, so the fact that the behavior might change because they know that we're observing them. Okay, so we do have to consider that, and sometimes you have to take data longer because of that. We want something called inter-observer agreement, which basically means we'll have two observers and they'll compare their data and make sure it's the same. Again, I'm going to go over all these in detail in a moment, but I just want to get the list out first. Okay, so those are kind of the 6 main steps of recording behavior. So let's unpack those one at a time. So the very first step is defining the target behavior. Okay, so here we're going to develop an operational definition of the target behavior. So what do we mean by that? What's an operational definition? Kind of behavior or aggressive, sorry. People are asking questions in the chat. I just want to make sure. So it says, can a behavior analyst help adults who are aggressive and short-tempered? Yes. I work with a lot of clients who engage in behaviors that would lead you, that are aggressive and things like that. And yes, we can work on that with them. Okay. Developing an operational definition. It should be very clear. So it describes exactly what the person says and does without the use of labels. Okay. So again, we're not using labels. Okay. We want to be very clear, use specific instances of behavior that we're talking about. And also consider the average reading level of American adults. Okay, you don't want to be using, when I write my opera definitions for me, they might be very technical, but then I spell it out, right? So I explain exactly what each term means and how we use that and why. So you want to make sure that anyone, even someone who doesn't know all of the technical jargon, can read your plan and understand it. Okay. The definition should be concise. Okay. Include everything that needs to be there, but nothing else. This should not be a long-winded definition. It needs to be very clear and very concise. You want to make sure that everything that should be in there is in there, but nothing else. You don't want a bunch of extra fluff in your definition of a target behavior. And finally, it should be objective. Okay, we should be using active verbs that are objective and unambiguous. You shouldn't be making inferences about internal states or motivation or how the client feels or what their emotions are, right? Action verbs only. Okay. Basically, you want someone else who wants to observe that behavior should be able to read your definition and collect data on that behavior, and it should be the exact same as yours. We should be able to agree on what the behavior looks like because of the definition. As long as the definition is written so well that anyone can read it and observe it, that's how you know you have a good operational definition. Okay, you want at least two observers to agree on what they're looking at. Okay. So the definition should also be specific to the person you're observing. Okay, so this is how we define a target behavior. I'm going to use the example of nail biting. Okay, and notice how specific and detailed this definition will be. Okay, anyone who reads it will know exactly how to take data on it. So what we're going to say, the definition for nail biting: anytime Anna's fingers are in her mouth and her teeth are closed together on the finger, nail, cuticle, or skin around the nail, we're going to count this as an instance of nail biting. Okay, so her fingers are in her mouth, her teeth have to be closed together, and they can be closed on the finger, on the nail, on the cuticle, or the skin around the nail. Okay, so very, very specific. Sometimes we'll even have like the amount of time they're in the mouth, right? Anytime Anna's fingers are in her mouth for more than 2 seconds and her teeth are closed together, and so on and so forth, right? So it gets very detailed and very specific. Any questions about defining a target behavior? Okay. Step 2, determining the logistics of measuring behavior. So the first thing we might look at is who should be doing the recording, right? Who should record the data? Who should record what behavior? So there are 2 ways we can record behavior. The first is through an independent observer. So this is someone who's not the individual engaging in the behavior. It's someone who's watching the behavior happen. So if we have a student in the class, the independent observer is the teacher or the teacher's aide, right? If it's a child in the home, maybe the independent observer is the parent. Okay, so it's someone other than the person who's engaged in the behavior. They have to be really well trained to do this, right? So this means that as the behavior analyst, I have to go in and I have to go over the definition with them. I have to train them exactly how we're going to collect data, what to do, and they have to know exactly what they should be doing. You can't just kind of throw them in there and be like, okay, make sure you write down how many times she bites her nails today, without telling them like what that means, what that looks like, how, like, do you want to know how many times? Do you want to know how many times in an hour? Do you want to know how many times throughout the day? Like, what do you want to know, right? And it has to be a doable recording system, because if the system that you've put in place is so complicated to collect the data, they're just not going to do it, or they're going to give you fake data. Like, they're just going to do it so that you think they took the data, but it won't be real data, and is going to affect how the treatment is going, right? So it has to be doable. Whenever I'm working with my clients, I do sit down with their caretakers and I say, okay, like, tell me about your day. Do you work from home? Are you retired, right? How often are you with the client? I need to know what their availability is so that I can determine what they can and cannot handle as far as collecting data for me, right? Some caretakers are not in the home hardly at all. They don't work from home. The client is pretty independent. They spend their own money. They go out in the community on their own. The caretaker isn't with them very much. So they probably won't have that caretaker take data on them, right? But if I do, it has to be really simple and really doable. So things like, I'll have the caretaker, I'll give them a paper calendar and say, as long as so-and-so brushes their teeth, just put a check mark on the calendar for me, please. Right? Simple, easy to do, doable, not something that requires a lot of work. This comes into play in classrooms a lot too. If we ask our teachers, I mean, they're dealing with all kinds of crap, especially right now, right? Some of them are having to do this hybrid teaching where they're teaching some students online and some students in person. If you give them this big, long, complicated to-do list of how to collect behavior for this kid, they're just not going to do it. They can't. So you have to make sure that what you're asking the observer to do is actually doable for them, okay, in their environment and in their situation. You can also do self-monitoring, which basically means that the individual who's engaging in the behavior is taking their data on the behavior themselves. Okay. We do this for a few reasons. First and foremost, if an independent observer isn't possible. So like I said, if a caretaker isn't home a lot or they're not with my clients a lot, I probably wouldn't ask them to take data because they're not going to see the behavior happen. They're never with them, right? If the behavior is really infrequent, so it just doesn't happen that often, the caretaker might not be around when it finally does happen, or I might not be around when it finally does happen, right? Or if the behavior occurs in isolation. So when nobody else is around, maybe this individual does it only in their room when they're alone, right? We have a client right now who's engaging in some pretty serious skin picking, right? So they pick their skin, like to the point where they're picking their skin off, right? They've got open sores on their arm and on their hands that have to be treated by medical staff. They have to go into urgent care and all that stuff. And it's really hard to get this individual to stop doing it because they never do it if someone else is around. Never. It just doesn't happen. They only do it when they know nobody's there, right? So we've had to get really creative and try to make sure they're not left alone very much and things like that. But if they're left alone for even a few minutes, like they're gonna pick at their skin. So those are the times when you would use self-monitoring. Okay. That was also used a lot when COVID-19 was happening and everything was shut down and we were not allowed to go into people's homes. We were not allowed to go into kids' homes and things like that. So I relied a lot on my clients self-monitoring their behavior at that time. Okay. Step 3. When and where to record. So this is also having to do with choosing a recording method, right? So we're continuing with step 3. So in addition to deciding the recording method, we have to decide when and where we're going to record, right? Is the behavior occurring at home or at school or at work, right? So we have to determine where we're going to go to observe the behavior, what time of day we record the behavior. If the behavior only happens in the morning, I'm not going to tell a caretaker to record the behavior in the afternoon. That doesn't make any sense, right? I have a client who are working on showering goals and he always takes his shower in the morning. So I'm not going to tell the family home provider like, oh, if he showers at night, take some data. Well, he never showers at night, right? So we have to take the data in the morning. And the observation period, so when we're going to observe the behavior and when we're going to take data has to be specified beforehand, right? So we always want to kind of lay out the groundwork. We want to have a plan in place before we start recording. It shouldn't just happen kind of on the fly. And again, we can use, our indirect assessment will give us all of that information of, an idea of what time of day and where the behavior occurs and things like that. Okay. We do have to obtain consent, of course, beforehand for these things, in terms of like, when the behavior, if we come in when the behavior occurs, of course, we have to have consent for that, right? So you can't just go into someone's home and be like, okay, I'm here because you told me they showered in the morning. Like the client has to consent in some way, shape, or form, as does the caretaker. We can observe the behavior in either a natural or analog setting. Okay, so natural setting is where the behavior typically occurs in the natural environment. So that would be the individual's home, maybe their classroom. We're going to go into those settings in the natural environment and observe the behavior. Okay, versus a analog setting would be like a clinic. Okay, so basically like a laboratory setting. It's not the individual's normal routine. It's not their normal environment. It's a much more controlled environment. which is why we do it, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages to both of these things. So the natural setting, if you collect data in the natural setting, you're more likely to see the behavior occur and get a pretty accurate picture of how often it occurs and where it occurs and so on and so forth, right? Because the individual is in their natural environment where they normally engage in that behavior. So that is one big advantage. But it's not controlled, okay? The analog setting is really controlled, which means that if there are any kind of like interfering variables or things that like don't happen that often, but maybe in that one instance it happened and it affected the client's behavior, in a natural setting, you have no control over that, right? Those different variables can happen at any time and you can't really control for that. In an analog setting, in a clinic, you can make sure that anything you don't want to happen doesn't happen, right? You have full control over that. But the analog setting it might affect their behavior because it's not their normal environment, right? They know they're at a clinic, they know their behavior is being observed. It's a different environment, different atmosphere. So you also might get changes in behavior. So for the most part, I mean, most places will go and observe the behavior in the natural environment. A lot of there are organizations that work with kids with disabilities, and you bring them into the clinic, and that's where they receive all of their services. So when you first bring on a client, you might not start collecting data on their behavior right away. You give them a couple of weeks to get used to the environment. And now that they're coming every day and they know everyone and they're getting used to the schedule of activities and so on and so forth, then you start taking data, right? So that kind of analog clinic setting doesn't affect their behavior. With my clients, we don't have a clinic. So I am always going into their natural environment. I'm never taking them to a clinic or doing like an analog control setting, things like that. Okay, so let's see. People are asking questions. So when you visit your previously stayed client and purposely ask us, they're still considered a natural environment? Yes, because it's still like at their home or in their room. When I go to ask them to do something, they're still in their natural environment. Okay, I'm a different person, but they're in their natural environment. An analog setting of that would be me taking them to like a clinic setting and then asking them to do a bunch of stuff that they don't normally do in a place they don't normally do it. Okay. Is it ethical for family members to privately work with behavior analysts to fix one's aggressive behaviors without telling the client? No. I would never do that, especially with adults. Even with kids, I mean, we do have to have consent of some kind, as far as like letting them know, like, okay, so-and-so is going to come work with you. We're going to work on, remember when you yelled at mommy the other day? Well, so-and-so is going to come in and work with you on that, right? We're going to try and make sure you don't yell at mommy anymore. With our clients, with my clients and the adult population, it is a lot different than working with kids. But we know that is definitely not done without they know exactly why I'm there. I ask them very specific questions like, on this date, you threw the remote controller at your caretaker. Why did that happen? How often does that happen? And I do it in front of the individual and in front of the caretaker, right? There is nothing that is hidden there.
I have a question about that because since I have worked in a special needs classroom and we had a behaviorist come in, and when she came in to observe, because the student was so very, very aware of like when the behaviorist was there, and if she knew that it was because of her behavior, we wouldn't have had any like examples, I guess, of the behavior we're trying to modify. So I'm not sure that I don't know if the behaviors actually made the student aware. So is that like completely not?
No, in a school setting, it is a little bit different because you can, you can be there and observing the behavior without it being obvious that you're observing that child's behavior, if it makes sense. If you're going into a home where they're the only kid, like it's kind of
Yeah.
It's definitely there for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But in a classroom setting, it gets a little bit different in that sense.
Okay.
Because yes, you know, you're not singling that kid out, right? Like the person is probably sitting in the back of the classroom and observing
Right.
the child, but you could make the argument that they're observing any of the children in the classroom. So it doesn't single them out.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a little bit different when you're directly working with an individual. And in my case, again, it's very different from kids. My clients at any point could say to me, I don't want to do this anymore, and we have to be done. A little bit different with kids because parents can provide consent, right, for treatment
Right,
and things like that. But with adults who I work with, I absolutely cannot do anything without their consent every single time.
Okay.
So it depends on the environment you're in and the clients you're working with and so on and so forth.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. That is all I have for you today. So don't forget, I'm going to see you all in person on Tuesday. I'm excited to see your faces. There's a couple hands up that have questions. If anyone wants to go, you're free to go. But if you have a question, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will see you on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. There are no office hours today?
No, they're only on Tuesdays.
Okay.
Yeah, Tuesdays from 12 to 3.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Or more so say, so I went on the module and then I saw